when we're looking at the prison industrial complex, it's not just prisons and police, right? As Cheryl just illustrated, it's also ICE, it's also the FBI. But even beyond that, you know, all of our institutions are somehow threaded to police, prisons, and so forth, because police and prisons are how we keep people in line, right? And police and prisons are sort of the force that is backing up capitalism as a system to keep it going and white supremacy. And so it's kind of this looming ghost in all of our institutions, right? That like, this is what happens if you step out of line. But there's other ways that our institutions are connected to the prison industrial complex and to policing, and to carcerality, which I'm going to just briefly define as structures or mindsets that serve to punish people and control them. So I want us to take a look briefly at a few different kind of arenas of society and think about how are they connected to prisons, police, and carcerality. And a few questions that I think might be useful for us to think about as we're going through this is, what happens to people who break rules within these systems? What is it like to have a record within these systems? What is it like to be Black, brown, trans, low income, or severely mentally ill within these systems? What shared financial or political interests might these institutions have with prisons? How do the goals or methods overlap? And I can give an example for some of these. So for the first one, let's just kind of rapid fire go through schools. What are the similarities between schools and prisons? We already talked about how there are police officers in schools, much more so than there were several decades ago. But what other similarities can we think of? Where is there overlap? Obey orders. Yeah, there's a strict hierarchy in both prisons and schools. What happens if you don't obey orders in a school? Anyone?
Sent to school, prison, suspension, in school suspension,
detention, suspension. Sometimes, depending on who you are, you might be arrested. You might be impacted by that school resource officer. The hierarchy of infractions to suspensions to expulsion to alternative schools. Yes. Kevin says my high school building was modeled after a prison. Yeah, there's been some real discussion about sort of the architecture of carcerality, and how that plays into schools. Chris says targeting BIPOC people as if they are morally or mentally deficient, thinking about special needs and ESL in schools. Right, so we see these angles of oppression coming from multiple sources and really pervading everything, right?
Then like tracking people into like, you know, people destined for college, people who are destined for like, you know, you've got a record, so, you know, not
absolutely. Yeah, who are the compliant people ready for success, who are the delinquents who must be punished and separated. Officers and administration directly connecting students to law enforcement or using alcohol. Students' bags searched on entry, metal detectors, yes, absolutely. Even something as simple as the way the day is organized by bells. You know, you hear a bell and you know where to go. That's in prison and in school. Okay, and so we're kind of getting at here some of the school to prison pipeline. What about housing? Looking back to the questions that I shared in the chat again, what happens if you break the rules in housing? What is it like to have a record? What is it like to have any of these identities? How do the financial or political interests of, let's say, housing developers overlap with prisons or nonprofits that run shelters? Looking at public, private, and shelter housing. Redlining, yeah. Application approval based on employment or income. Credit. Some nonprofits might penalize houseless people who repeatedly need to use shelters. Yeah. A lot of shelters have really strict hierarchies as well, and you can get kicked out very easily. It's also a lot more exposure to criminalization, disenfranchisement, and losing your right to vote. Yeah, certain kinds of records as well might exclude you from certain kinds of public housing. If you don't have housing, you can't vote.